Schizophrenics of Reddit, what were the first signs of your break from reality, and how would you warn others for early detection? As someone who has schizophrenia, reading all the comments on this thread made me feel about 5,000 times less alone than usual. That being said, for me, it was thinking that all my friends were plotting against me. So much so that I started digging as hard as I could to find as much dirt on everyone as possible. Auditory hallucinations followed that pretty quickly. At its worst, I began misremembering important life events, only to find out years later that what I felt I so vividly remembered to be true was actually not. But I guess that's psychosis for you. Meds, therapy, and a fiancé and friends who have your back all work wonders, though. They don't judge me when things get rough. Careful worrying too much about auditory or visual hallucinations, though. You can get both of these from something as simple as really bad sleep deprivation. I've been there, and while that's also pretty unhealthy, it's not as big of a concern as other issues. Also, just like your eyes try to find faces and images, I think sometimes you can hear your voice in random noise. First thing was hearing voices of people I knew calling my name when they couldn't possibly be there. Like I would hear a family member or friend that lives 3 hours away by car. Then I started seeing objects, often while driving. Once on a lonely Nebraska night on Highway 2, a giant radio tower suddenly appeared in front of me in the road, and then dissipated when I drove through it. I also see silhouettes of people occasionally. Worst visual I have gotten was a very real-looking man trying to break into my house during the day, and it freaked me the few out. Happened twice. Edit. Also, blood-curdling screaming. Edit 2. Guys, I wanted to thank you for all the support and questions I have received in light of this post. I wish I could sit down and have an in-depth conversation with all of you, but I simply don't have the time to reply to every comment I get, sadly. I have answered a few questions posed to me, and I hope that helps you out. This sounds like a joke, but it's my real advice. If the shadow people acknowledge you, maybe see a doctor. Otherwise, just get some sleep. Edit. So like I have a million responses in my inbox, and it's fewing making me anxious. I won't be responding to any of them directly. If you're concerned, see a doctor. I went to my GP first, and he referred me to specialists. The reason it's bad if they acknowledge you is because if you're just sleep-deprived or mentally wonky, the shadow people tend to disappear when you focus on them, and don't appear to be up to any real funny business. Shadow people, what are they? Humanoids of questionable origin and intent, also made of shadows. For the one guy who was offended, why? I'm describing symptoms. Ely, though. Finally, no matter their cause, the shadow people can't hurt you. If they become overwhelming, I stand by my above advice and suggest trying to sleep it off. It started with not needing to sleep as much, countless days of being awake, driving endlessly to pointless destinations, disregarding police authority. I started hearing songs on the radio and thinking I was being given secret messages by them. Diagnosed schizoaffective bipolar here. Basically, I have both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It started when I was 5 years old. I would see dead people, feel the presence of ghosts, smell rust and metals, hear voices and thoughts of other people. As a teenager, I thought I was a psychic. As an adult, I started a job as a psychic medium. I legit thought I could predict the future. One day, I just decided I'm F-king crazy and got a psych evil. Been on medication ever since and super grounded. My major triggers are fourth wall-breaking video games and TV shows. The Truman Show is also horrifying for me. My mother, father, and college roommate all had schizophrenia. In the case of both of my mother and roommate, their first signs early on was hearing their name being called and no one was there. More voices came from my mother, and eventually visuals. My roommate started feeling things on her, then delusions, and every possible kind of hallucination. I don't know what the first signs were for my father, but earlier delusions were that he thought he was on a game show and that he was being watched by the CIA. Edit. This was a quick post, so I'll add more here for clarity. First, my roommate was feeling touches and insects on her. The feeling of insects is probably common. She would also see spiders, flies. She had an unusually quick progression and would hallucinate demons and sometimes flat out dissociate and go into something like a bad acid trip involving demons. My mother is currently medicated but still hears demons talking to her. She is highly religious now. She also apparently hears the voice of one of her previous miscarriages, which she says is comforting. During the day, she is very functional, but when she doesn't take medication, she gets bad, and her symptoms worsen at night. Voices tell her what to do, that is, don't drink wine. It used to be much worse with her. When I was a kid, she told me she was talking to Jesus and a baby in the guest room, and Jesus said I would live forever. She would bring food to the attic because she thought someone was living in it. Once I went into her bathroom and saw she had written in pencil all over the counters and walls, like in a movie. She told me she was moving to Brazil to find treasure. She told me my father would turn into a winged demon, fly around, and beat her. He probably did beat her. My father was mostly delusional, and he thought he was being watched by the government or aliens or anything. This was in common with my roommate, who thought she was being watched by government alien satellites and would cover the windows with foil. My dad doesn't speak much about his symptoms, but has told me he remembers traveling through time to watch my mother get abused as a child, with the help of aliens. A lot of you wondered how I am. I'm okay. One risk factor was that my parents were pretty big cokeheads for a while, but at least my mother's symptoms started before all of that. As mentioned, she was also abused as a kid, so this could have contributed. I'm currently getting my PhD in genetics. I try not to think too much about what motivates me to study this topic other than an interest and talent in the field. First sign was I can hear people from other side of the roads or in other rooms loud and clear, but instead of just whispering about their own conversation, I hear them talk about me, planning to do things to me. Any sounds at not a loud enough volume for me to hear clearly turns into a murder plot. Second sign was feeling of bugs crawling on me at all time. Of course, when I look, there is no bugs there, and the feelings go away. But this often keeps me up at night. I was convinced there was thousands of insects at all time on my skin. Third sign was the need to run away. I skip towns to towns because I have a bad feeling about it. Paranoia? Anger. Everyone is against me. Edit. Wow, this kind of blow up, so I thought I would add some additional information towards the drug trigger debate below. I thought it might help somebody in questing. Before schizophrenia, I was depressed, bulimic, and always had anxiety. I self-medicate a lot with drugs, and even had brief psychosis after prolonged meth usage. But drugs wasn't my trigger. In my 20s, I got married and then divorced, and the stress of it was what brings my adult onset to life. I have stopped using at that point. Schizophrenia is completely different with a drug-induced psychosis, and I know different people have different triggers. But if you think you might have some symptoms of schizophrenia, I suggest you stay far away from stress as much as possible, because that's what happened to me. Therapy helps a lot of people, but it didn't help me. I don't like to talk about it. I don't know if it was the great distrust I have in people, or whatever reasons, I just feel like I suffer twice when I talk about it. I used to be very open with people and therapists when it was just depression, but now I keep everything to myself because I just want to forget. I am terrified of drugs now because of what might happen, so I have not used any since my diagnosis, but I drink heavily, and it helps me in a strange way. Make me get through the day. I see a question ask if I can tell what is real and what is not, and the answer is no. I went through a period of time of being cyberbullied, doxxed, and stalked after my diagnosis, and from it I am now scared of cell phones, doorbells, mails, interactions in general, any kind of social media interaction that is not anonymous like Reddit. But I still wonder if it was real or it was me. I genuinely have no idea. I believed it was real, but who knows? I don't. One of the saddest thing about being a schizo is how life-changing it is. And things changing is a trigger for most schizophrenic. It is a complete, dark merry-go-round. I used to have a great job. I used to have people who love me. I used to travel the world. Everything that was good for me, leave me, or I ran away from it. When something positive comes to me, I thought, I am here, but I am not the person supposed to be here. And I fuel it up. It spirals, and you are so scared, but you can't help yourself. And yes, schizophrenia get worse. All the time. You thought you get used to it, and then new shaz show up. I have given up on meds because there is no true cure, just mere comfort. It just makes me binge eat, get fat, and then comes the worsen, bulimia, and body dysmorphia. Can't look at my own face anymore. Can't look at my own. The only things that helps is silence, laying in the dark, and try to forget. My boyfriend was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. The first signs I believe were hearing or sensing beings in his room while he was going to sleep. The first ones I heard about as they happened was he would see something out of the corner of his eye. There is a baboon in the lab? But then when he would turn to look directly, he would realize it was a student. Later, there were a lot of obsessive behaviors. Burning off freckles thinking they were cancerous, boiling a toothbrush to nothing if it fell on the counter, making me repeat reassuring words repeatedly for hours. I eventually broke up with him, which prompted his schizophrenic break. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of emails detailing how he was going to rape and kill me. He believed he was sent from God, and me from the devil, and he had to destroy me. He left disgusting messages on my family's home phone about me, stalked me, and later found out he made a web page about me. Good news is years later he is doing well, though he still suffers a lot and is not happy. He has a fantastic job, wife he adores, great house, etc. I heard the disease described, I think by a schizophrenic on Reddit, as you were on a plane to Hawaii, and then you crash land in Siberia, and you realize that is where you live now. I had a friend who started talking about a random new program he was working on Facebook. He was a cake decorator, so no one knew what he was talking about. Then he was randomly posting things like F everyone. He had very angry posts, and then he would post a bunch of random numbers the next day. He kept saying he was working on the programs and these were the numbers he found. After a few months of this, he disappeared on social media for a bit. Then he came back and said he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and was in treatment for it now. He also apologized for telling everyone to F off. Edit. Sorry, I'm a bit vanilla flavored and don't like to cuss, even online. LOL. I don't mind if you all do, though. Also, I've never had so many likes. Woo! I did lose close contact with him, but only because I live in another state. I did talk to him a few years back, and he said he was taking medication for schizophrenia. He said he had thought the FBI had him working on program using the radio. He said he had pages and pages of number written down. He is still a FB friend, though. He posts the most gorgeous cakes. He is a perfectionist. One of my husband's good friends was never formally diagnosed, but we're almost certain he had some form of paranoid schizophrenia. He began to be very paranoid about anything when his symptoms first started. He believed a lot of conspiracy theories, like crazy ones about aliens invading and that a group of aliens from space were watching his every move. On one occasion, he and my husband had gone to a coffee shop together, and after about 45 minutes, the friends started to tense up and talked about how another man in the shop was a secret agent sent to spy on him. Instead of saying something like, "Nah, man, everything's fine, you're overreacting," my husband grabbed his friend's hand and said, "Man, that sounds terrifying. Let's get out of here and go to another shop instead where you'll feel more safe." I tear up a little bit just thinking about it. He was a completely normal guy until his symptoms started around age 23, with the exception of having some depression and probably being an alcoholic. He was an incredibly smart guy, but last year he killed himself. He had been largely abandoned by his friends for being too weird, and he didn't have much going for him when he had to move back home with his parents. But I'll always remember how kind and compassionate my husband was to him in those last months. His parents were also not very helpful and kind of brushed off his weird mannerisms, and so they didn't try to get him help. My first indication that he had become schizophrenic were his really cryptic Facebook posts that he'd make. They just seemed a little off. Nothing that would make you scream, "Oh my gosh, I think he's schizophrenic." They were just much different to things he'd normally post. Was going to make a throwaway account, but I shouldn't even have to. Many people can be predisposed for whatever reason towards schizophrenia, but never have it triggered. For me, a childhood and teenhood full of stress and dysfunction obviously built it up, and weed was the trigger. I started when I was 14. I liked it, but noticed a couple of times I caught freaky glimpses of things I knew couldn't be there. Thinking back, I also had a few experiences when I wasn't even high of bizarre things happening, like being in the middle of doing something and getting a weird sensation of parts of my body swinging big and small, or flashes of what I can only describe as texture, or one time, being zoned out in class, half aware of what everyone was doing, saying around me. Then suddenly I decided to focus on the lesson and everything around me repeated itself exactly as it had 5 minutes before. This wasn't déjà vu, not a feeling. I knew exactly what people were about to say and what was going to come up on the next PowerPoint slide before it did. It was weird, but thinking the teacher must just be going through her slides again. I asked my friend next to me, "Didn't we just go through all this?" And he gave me a weird look and said no. That was really freaky. I can't explain it to this day. Although I guess I have this diagnosis. Anyway, as a kid, I always zoned out and found it hard to concentrate in class. When I was a small child, I also remember randomly hearing a sound, as if someone had said, "Emmy, ah," but kind of knowing it must have just been some brain glitch. I thought everyone must have it. Sometimes I'd shout out one of the sounds and pretend I hadn't just to trick people, because I thought it was so normal. I remember the penultimate time I got high before Eshej hit the fan. I got a phone call from my dad telling me my younger sister had been taken to the doctor about a rash on her face, and they found it to be impetigo. It wasn't serious at all, but I freaked out. I knew it wasn't serious, but that didn't matter. I was still worried about it, and it wouldn't go away for a good hour. The time I got high after that is when the aforementioned fan Esh hitting happened. I made hash brownies with a friend. We took one each and went to the cinema. Quarter of the way through the film, everything suddenly changed. The universe, everything. There was a sudden sense of impending doom. I went to the toilet for a breather. It didn't help. I thought, a fizzy drink will help sugar fluid? I got a Sprite. I thought, exercise, just walk. I left the cinema and walked down the high street. I kept seeing people I knew everywhere. I remember not being able to tell if it was real or not. The panic hadn't relieved by the time I got to the other end of the high street. I thought, coffee? Caffeine? I got a shitty McDonald's coffee. I'd never bought one in my life before. I hate the stuff. I walked back up the high street with my Sprite in one hand, my coffee in the other, alternately sipping both of them in desperation, walking through crowds and crowds of faces I hadn't seen in years. I thought I just need time. I'd left my friend in the cinema, so I texted her saying I couldn't go back in. I'd meet her outside after it finished, and I sat for what felt like hours, silently freaking out in my head while the world crashed down around me. I think the sun started going down. Eventually, I got a text from her saying I wasn't there when she'd came out and she'd gone home. I have no idea how that happened. So I went home and told myself, sleep. You just need to sleep it off and everything will be fine. I laid in bed, freaking the few out for hours, feeling like I was sinking into my mattress. At one point, I saw a flash of something I don't want to start talking about. I don't know if my eyes were open or closed, but I can only say that I felt like I'd seen a glimpse of hell itself, and even a glimpse was too much terror to comprehend. I tried sleeping that night, but I couldn't. I had a weird trance-like thing going on instead of sleep. I was aware of the whole thing, and I was just there in my head watching thousands of strains of thought for what felt like eternity. I can't remember the specifics of the next day, but I was desperately hoping and telling myself that the high would wear off soon, but it didn't. It wasn't a high. I'd triggered a fully blown psychotic episode that lasted in total about a year. It went very much untreated because the services local to me are incompetent as esh. I spent months in a constant panic attack. Extreme paranoia and delusions set in, even though I knew they shouldn't be there. I thought people were coming to get me. I thought evil was trying to taint me through TV, radio, CDs, and my parents' CD cases. I ripped up art coursework I'd done because certain songs were playing on the radio whilst I did it, and it was evil. I was afraid to look at my feet because they looked weird, and I was scared I'd chop them off or something. The warm tap was evil and the cold good, so I had cold baths. Everything I had once loved was evil. I wasn't allowed to listen to my music or play my instruments. At one point, I thought I had to choose between my mom and my dad because one was evil and the other was good. Everything became about the duality of good and evil, and everything was a test. Everything about me before this happened was evil. I started religiously carrying apples with me everywhere because an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And I knew that something was very, very wrong. I just couldn't do anything about it. I was so panicked that I couldn't even keep my daily apple down. Everything I put in my mouth felt too weird, and everything I swallowed would come back up within half an hour because my stomach was constantly in knots. I lost about 2 stone in the first month or so. I couldn't be left alone for 1 second. I needed to be with someone 24/7. Every night I had to continuously sip water and count my breathing just to keep calm enough to pass out from exhaustion. Wake up a few hours later in full, I'm going to die panic mode, and repeat. It just didn't stop. It was F-king relentless. It was so horrific. Several years later, I got a diagnosis of schizoaffective bipolar disorder. I don't know if I agree with it being as simple as that. I view my life in 2 parts now, before this event and after this event. Everything changed then, and I have never felt the same as before it happened. I was 16, now I'm 23. I definitely don't feel like I did when it first started, but I definitely don't feel like I did before. I've been in recovery pretty much ever since. It's caused so much trouble in my life and stopped me progressing in so many ways. My head just doesn't work the same way anymore, and I think I've had to grieve for what felt like the death of the person I used to be. Turned my post into a bit of a story and event, but sometimes it just needs to come out. I think there were signs, but no one picked up on anything. Not schizophrenic, but bipolar, which has led to psychosis. For me, it started with derealization and depersonalization, and escalated from there. I wasn't real, and the world wasn't real led to seeing spiders all over the walls, and thinking that aliens were trying to kill me and I had to kill them first. A friend was concerned, and had the police do a welfare check, and I tried to stab the cop with a large knife because I thought he was an alien. That esh is scary. Once they got me into the hospital and got me some treatment, I did much better. I'm actually off all my meds now, and doing pretty good as far as my delusions, but my life is also in a much better place. There is hope. I made a throwaway because I really wanted to share this. I started smoking pot heavily when I was 16 or 17 and started to use magic mushrooms as well. Eventually, I thought that an angel named Satan, yes, the Satan, visited me. I basically hallucinated him inside of my head and found him charismatic, charming, and awesome. I was having conversations with who I thought was Satan. Yes, again, the Satan, but I didn't think he was evil. I thought he was a pretty angel. I made my own Ouija board to try and communicate with Satan and other beings. I was told through the board that I was the world's chosen messiah. I would just use my point finger and it would move on its own. I believed every bit of it and thought I was Satan's chosen messiah and that the world was going to come to an end. I told a bunch of people this, and I even got a girlfriend while I was claiming to be Satan. Not joking. I thought I had superpowers related to energy and could heal diseases and perform miracles. When I eventually told my parents of my revelation, they called a local priest on me to basically talk to me and exorcise me. I cursed him in the name of Satan and he left, very scared. I eventually was taken to a mental hospital by my parents, and then I lied to all of the mental hospital people. I told them that I was just a normal guy and my parents were uptight Christians. Truth is, I was batsh insane. I lied to everyone at the mental hospital, and they let me out 3 days later. At this point, I made peace with my parents, and I stopped sharing my delusional thoughts. Eventually, the delusions disapparated on their own. Some things I did under delusions. Stayed awake for days with amphetamines and played the Ouija board. The Ouija board said that I would win the lottery, no doubt. So I convinced my friend at the time to play lottery tickets with me. I remember how disappointed we were when all we won was like enough to buy a pack of cigarettes after playing all different types of lotto. I tried to summon demons using a ram's horn and tried to make creepy puppets. It weirded me out, so I threw the skull into the woods somewhere at a homeless camp. I convinced at least 3 other people of my delusion. I basically made my own delusional cult at the age of 19 or so. I won't reveal anything about them, obviously, but still. I then convinced a girl that I met online that I was the Messiah, and we had a horrible relationship for 1 year. Thought that muffins were communicating messages to me secretly because I was the Messiah. I laid on hands a mentally disabled guy at my workplace and thought I healed him of his sins. He thanked me. Had a sit-down talk with a member of a Catholic church whom I was trying to deceive somehow. So yeah, if you're 16/17, stay away from psychedelic drugs. It might send your schizophrenia into high gear by 18/19 like it did for me. It feels good to get it off my chest. None of this is a joke. I've never told anyone this. Disclaimer. It's hard to say if this was caused by schizophrenia or something else, as I was incorrectly diagnosed with something else and had a poor reaction to the meds, or more accurately had a poor reaction to quitting the meds because I didn't like the side effects. Anyways, I became convinced that the universe was a Matrix-like simulation and that I was some kind of main character, if you will, and that I wouldn't face any negative consequences for my actions since I was destined to win. I stopped going to my job, but I didn't mention it to my fiancé. I'd just head out in the morning and go few around for 8 hours. I'd had a fairly conservative upbringing and had only had sex with my fiancé, which I decided wasn't fair, so I set about trying to few as many women as possible. I slept with about 5 women during this episode, and at the time felt zero remorse because, hey, I'm the star of the show, and since I want to do it, that makes it okay. In retrospect, it's probably good that my deluded self didn't decide killing people for fun, or something was a good way to test out life without rules. I also sometimes think back to my behavior during that time and question things like self-identity, or the idea of a set personality. In my normal state, I'm a somewhat quiet and unassuming guy, but deluded me was a charming, confident devil who took risks and always knew what to say to women. Kind of scary, honestly. This all took place over the course of just under a month. A couple of weeks to decide this was all a joke and that following the rules was for suckers. Then 2 weeks of not going to work and sleeping around. Obviously, my fiancé found out and left me, and my parents forced me to go back to the psychiatrist after that. Thanks, Dad. The warning signs were the pretty typical sudden shift in worldview and erratic behavior, but I was really going out of my way to hide it. But yeah, if your friend or family member goes from deeply religious to atheist seemingly overnight, or vice versa, and they undergo a drastic change in behavior, particularly if it's for the worse, that's bad news. The good news is that the proper meds, mindfulness, and having a fairly rigid and disciplined lifestyle allow me to lead a pretty normal life, so that's nice. Forgive me for putting my condescending pants on, but it appears to me from your comments that you are concerned about some of the symptoms you have been experiencing. If you are worried that you may be developing a mental disorder, please go talk to your regular doctor or a psychiatrist about what you are going through. As you say, chances are that what you have been feeling could be nothing, but worst case scenario, and you do have a mental disorder, early treatment has been shown to improve outcomes and delay could make things worse. Even just talking about things can sometimes help, and your doctor, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist are trained to handle these discussions. Reddit is, for the most part, a terrible place for medical advice and full of anecdotal evidence. Situational irony of this post aside, and seeking help from a trained and licensed professional is the best advice that I can give you. If this post was made out of pure curiosity, then please forgive my unsolicited lecture. Be well. Sorry for the length, don't really think I could shorten this though. I was just about to turn 18 and doing a lot of psychedelics. I ended up finding MDMA and mushrooms were a good mix and helped with my anxiety and depression. One time I ended up getting pure meth instead of MDMA. I did a lot of mushrooms along with it and had a really intense trip. At the end of this trip was a crippling depression. A couple weeks went by and I just went crazier and crazier. I think it was the depression IDK, what the meth mixed with shrooms did, but nothing made me happy anymore. I was too depressed to even kill myself, if that makes sense. I seemed to be fine before this, depressed and anxious and a young insomniac, but nothing seriously crazy or nearly this intense. Now, it's hard to tell when you're crazy because it seems king normal. Taking a cigarette and leaving it in a glass of water out in the sun to drink it as a tea and gain spiritual superpowers sounds crazy as fewing. But phoo, after that trip it was a walk in the park. I thought I was God and could change dimensions at will. And the scariest thing was I almost could. I would feel sensations that are very hard to describe. An example would be my thoughts would spiral up like a radio tower through my head and float above me. Or I felt a giant winged bug instead of lungs for a couple seconds. It sounds crazy, but I really physically felt sensations like this. I spiraled out of control and ended up in jail and rehab. Didn't do anything else besides smoke weed and cigs for a year after that trip. I could write a trilogy on my experiences in jail and the 3 court-ordered rehabs I ended up in. It was wild. Tons of abuse, physical, mental, and psychological. It was very confusing and really made my mind warp bad for a while. Eventually, after 6 months, I got to this point where I would be okay 90% of the time and then have a bad week. Eventually, I got home and then got diagnosed with bipolar, got antipsychotics, and that helped a bunch. Later on, and I'm officially diagnosed as bipolar and schizoaffective. I'm 23 now, haven't had a serious break of reality for a couple years now, thanks to an antipsychotic I take consistently. I have gone off it in the past and had episodes after some time. It seems like I had warning signs before that bad trip, but I'm sure my episodes wouldn't be as bad without that trip I had. I'm in no way discouraging proper and safe psychedelic use unless you have a family history of concerning mental health. They really did help me an immense amount before I had that experience. Now it's too risky. Edit. Okay, so there's one huge thing that I didn't do during that big episode. I didn't tell anyone what I was experiencing. I kept it to myself, and I think that's why everything spiraled so far out of control. I definitely was paranoid then, and that might be part of the reason, but kind of didn't want anybody to know and thought it would just blow over like a hangover or something. It didn't, and it got worse. So if you're worried about your mental health, talk to someone you trust about it. Unusual beliefs. I didn't have hallucinations, but I had delusions. I had to cover up my webcam on my laptop because I believed I was being spied on through it. That was probably the first sign. I then took the batteries out of my smoke detector because I believed my smoke detectors had hidden microphones in it listening to me. I became convinced I was tracked online. Soon I started getting hidden messages in music and videos. Like I thought music videos made by celebrities were about me and communicating to me messages. Like Bad Blood was a celebrity mad at me. A video by Katy Perry about birthdays made me think she was trying to tell me of an upcoming economic collapse. I believed they were hidden messages from my eyes only. Soon I believed people were out to get me, out to kill me. People walking in the same direction as me on the street were following me, and I was hospitalized multiple times. I wanted it to stop. I wanted to die. I drank bleach, doused myself in gasoline, ECT. There was no talking me out of my delusions. I believed them 100% as if they were a religious belief. They weren't logical either. Even when I would admit that I couldn't prove what I believed, I still believed it and thought everyone else was wrong. For 3 years, I was delusional. I watched old game shows 12 hours a day because I only newly made commercials and videos had hidden messages for me. Finally, over this last summer, it cleared up. I could finally see clearly that I was delusional, and only then did I accept my diagnosis as schizophrenic. Not myself, but my best friend. She got very paranoid. She was convinced her roommate was putting cameras up in the apartment. This was in 2005, so well before that they were affordable. She said people were following her and taking her things. Knowing what we do now, these were red flags. Problem was, she was always kind of dippy, and the change in her behavior was so slight at first I don't think there was any way we could have known. She had her first break about 5 months later. Schizophrenia runs in my family, but I haven't been diagnosed. Not that I go to the doctor. And the symptoms all stopped suddenly about half a year ago. But it started off with physical hallucinations. Small stuff like the feeling of spiders on me, but then it grew to feel like I'm covered in spiders. Then the feeling of a rope around my neck choking me. I started hearing voices whispering gibberish in my ear. These were inconvenient, but didn't really mess with my life. But one morning I woke up because I heard a beep. The first thought in my head was, the fewing aliens put a device to record me, and spent about an hour looking for it before I realized I was being crazy. This happened a bit for a couple of years. Then suddenly it stopped. Not sure why, but I'm glad. My brother suffered from delusions. He never received a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He was extremely adverse to sharing his symptoms in therapy. Hindsight is 20/20, but I believe his initial onset was in his early 20s. He became extremely paranoid, very into conspiracy theory, isolated himself from his friends and family, had very erratic sleep patterns, and had some visual hallucinations involving lights and geometric patterns. He was living alone at the time, so I really can't say exactly how extensive everything was. It then progressed to much more elaborate delusions and erratic behavior as he got older. For what is worth, I know now that schizophrenia is progressive, and outcomes are best when a person receives treatment with the initial onset of symptoms. Didn't happen to me, and didn't hear about it directly, but from my teacher. During his college years, there was one kid that was like genius-level intelligence. Up there with Albert Einstein, common analogy I know. And better, he actually worked hard and didn't use his intelligence as an excuse from work. He made damn sure he would get his medical degree, never partying or slacking in any way, shape, or form. Then it's graduation week, he's aced the classes, and everybody is finally free from the work, and school is basically over, so he decides to go talk with his professor. So they're chatting and such, and the guy keeps looking at something above the professor, but shrugs it off as looking at a light too long. Yeah, that thing. Several minutes pass, he's still seeing this green orb just floating above the professor's head, and finally decides to point it out. Prof turns, doesn't see anything, sees how seriously this kid thinks he's seeing something so bizarre, turns to Dr. Mode and starts asking a few routine questions. Finds out kid has just had a schizophrenic break. Yeah, if you have schizophrenia, you can't be a doctor if any kind, spent years working his ass off just for it to go down the drain when he's finally reached his goal. Life sucks sometimes. TLDR guys spent years not slacking of it all in college, has a schizophrenic break during graduation week, years of medical college down the drain. Edit. To people thinking this was a psychosis break or something similar and temporary, he had recurring incidents and was tested. He was proven to have schizophrenia. The first sign for me was seeing two of my best friend in her house when I came over. Not like in a friendly way, like this is a fewing doppelganger and it will eat me kinda way. There were several times during the middle of the night I would get so freaked out by them I'd call my parents, this was in elementary school, to pick me up, and we lived a city away. During high school, I would start having trouble with sleep, oversleeping to the point of falling asleep in class and standing up in the halls, and not sleeping sometimes for days. Then, I'd start to hear my name being called randomly, and it would make me jump at how sudden it was. And I started thinking something paranormal was stalking me, and I'd hear creaks and bumps and footsteps in the house, and the smell of dead things when no one was home. Senior year, I started detaching from my friends, and I got more irritated at things. A year after high school, I went into an episode where I thought that thing was in my house and really trying to hurt me this time, and I ran out of the house and through the streets, convinced that anyone that came into sight was there to get me. When that ended, I realized, hey, that's not normal. Something's off. But I still didn't do anything until about half a year into working at my job. I was getting burnt out fast because I kept thinking my clients could hear my thoughts and would follow me home after my shift ended. Moral of my story is if you're in high school and you have a sudden change that feels like depression, but also is coupled with very fantastical thoughts, and you catch it, that's when you need to go check it out. If you're in your 20s and you start hearing your name being called more frequently than the normal person might, you definitely need to get checked out, because that can escalate very quickly into hearing voices full on. The first signs were grandiose beliefs in myself, thinking I would be a revolutionary Steve Jobs type person, thinking people on TV were giving me deep messages, thinking the thoughts in my head were being broadcast to other people I looked at. To warn others, I would highly recommend not doing psychedelic drugs, including marijuana, if there is any mental illness history in your family. I'm not schizophrenic, but I developed psychosis which, from what I understand, is pretty much temporary schizophrenia. I started thinking I was going insane for no particular reason, just felt like I was kind of losing it for some reason. I constantly had the recurring feeling that my front teeth were loose and would fall out. I started randomly engaging in creative writing on Reddit, which I believed was much deeper and more profound than it was. I spent a lot of time fixating on these philosophical ideas that I thought were revolutionary, and I would walk around feeling like I was working on some profound puzzle in my head, but I don't think I was necessarily thinking of anything in particular, I just felt like I was. I checked my pupils constantly to see if one was dilated, because I heard in a nursing class I took in high school that it's a sign of severe mental illness, which, as I said, I felt like I was developing. I started seeing lots of patterns in speech and text like I was extracting some deeper meaning from it. I started thinking I was becoming enlightened and that I was a genius. I had random flashes of visual snow. Eventually, I suddenly had a hallucination after I wrote one of my crazy creative writing things. It's pretty shocking how quick it went from 0 to 100. One day I was just unhinged, then I posted a creative writing thing on Reddit, and suddenly I thought the government was targeting me because I posted something really profound. The next day I thought people in my college class were talking about me when they were just having normal conversations. A few days later, I thought I was being mind-controlled and started having conversations with a voice in my head that I thought was a CIA operative who was interviewing me about the I posted on Reddit. It's pretty nefarious how much it can completely change your perception of reality. You can have thoughts like suspecting you're losing your mind while simultaneously engaging in crazy SH that seems completely sane to you. It can also really fuel up your memory to the point that you can completely forget that you thought you were going crazy for months and just start believing you're being mind-controlled and talking to the CIA. Your delusions can convince you of one thing for a while, then you just disregard that completely and start believing something else that's equally or more crazy. Your state of mind and perception can be altered in profound ways comparable to LSD. All sorts of little coincidences or things that seem like coincidences can reinforce your delusions and make you believe they must be true. You can't just snap out of it. It becomes a part of your world, and you're constantly looking for things that reinforce your delusions, and many of those things are only in your head. Hallucinations extend beyond just seeing and hearing things to actually feeling, tasting, or smelling things. At one point, the voices were punishing me, and it felt like I was on fire, like an actual full-body sensation of being burned that made me keel over. They also made me feel perpetually, unbearably uncomfortable unless I positioned myself in particular ways. Thoughts and images were inserted into my head. I had recurring images of being raped by my father inserted into my head that were accompanied by tactile hallucinations of being felladed, along with sort of pseudo-visual hallucinations that I can't really describe. It was all very traumatizing. I still often question how sane I am because I know I wouldn't even notice it if I started losing my mind again. The strangest thing is how much it can seem like a voice in your head is a real thinking person. Early on, before they started torturing me, I even fell deeply in love with one of the voices. It's also like your emotions can be manipulated, so it's hard to say that those feelings of love weren't themselves a kind of hallucination or delusion. I still have images of being raped by my father and very mild tactile hallucinations that cause me to close my legs and cover my genitals. I also still have voices on occasion. It's been about 2 years now, so it could be schizophrenia, I guess, but my psychiatrist hasn't indicated that.